Hey, BookTube. Welcome to the History Shelf for this special interview with one of my favorite historical fiction writers, Jeff Shaara. This was a highlight of my reading and BookTube career, I have to say. I've always been a big fan of Jeff Shaara, and I got to have a nice little conversation with him about his latest book, The Shadow of War. So without further ado, here's my interview with Jeff Shaara. Thanks. Great. All right, Jeff, welcome to the History Shelf.
Thank
Uh,
you.
yes, we are so excited to have you here. My viewers knew about this interview coming up. They're very excited to see this. So we are here today to talk about your new book, The Shadow of War, a novel of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And let me just say by preface that, Jeff, he's one of my all-time, historical fiction writer heroes. I've been following your work all these years. I've written to you from on your website, and you've always been so kind to write back. Interesting note, everybody. Jeff will reply to each and every person who emails him. It will take time. He says that on his website, but that goes to show that you really care about your readership. So I just want to say thank you.
Well, I mean, it doesn't really cost me anything to do that, and except time. And if someone's really interested and they're interested in what I'm doing, what I wrote, and they're just have a question, and so every now and then I get somebody with a bone to pick who's got a complaint. Okay, that's fine.
Right.
But for the most part, I mean, people are very nice and they're very generous. I mean, you're very generous with your time, having read my work. The least I can do is give it back to you.
Oh, well, I'm so very grateful. Thank you so much. All right, well, we're going to hop into your latest book. I've got a few questions here for you. Jeff's written well over 20 books by now, right?
Yes,
Something.
yeah, that is number 20.
Number 20.
Yes.
Yes. All right, and The Shadow of War comes out on May 14th. We're going to release this interview right around that time frame. But I've also written a review of this, which will be appearing in the Historical Novels Review magazine for the May issue. So can't say I've read it, loved it, and just want to hop right in and say, what made you choose this particular topic?
Well, it was an idea that really came up about 3 or 4 years ago. And I just started thinking about my own experience. And this is the first time I've had a book that I could research me. I mean, I was there. And so, I mean, I was 10 years old, but that's never happened before. So it was interesting to think about my personal experience as a kid, what it was like for my family, and then everything that was going on around us. I mean, I grew up in Tallahassee, Florida. One of the things about Tallahassee is it was on the route at that time. This is before interstate highways went through there. It was on the route from going anywhere, pretty much anywhere in the country to go to South Florida. You had to go through Tallahassee. And so we saw the convoys of trucks just nonstop going through town. And of course, there was an element of terror to that because you didn't know what was going on.
Wow.
The news really didn't tell you what was happening, but certainly something was happening. And so I remember that whole experience. I remember my father sitting us down in front of Walter Cronkite and having Kennedy come on the TV with his speech about what they were going to do. And I remember that the United Nations, Adlai Stevenson saying to the Russian ambassador, I'm prepared to wait till, we're prepared to wait till hell freezes over. I mean, I remember that.
Wow.
So again, about 4 years ago, I had planned on doing this, and then something else got in the way. I decided I got a lot of input from people, particularly people whose parents had served in World War II, who wanted to see me continue with more of the World War II stories. And so I did a 2-book set on the war in the Pacific about Pearl Harbor and Midway. And once I had finished with that, I changed publishers. So I used to be with Random House. Now I'm with St. Martin's Press. I'm very happy with that. That was a good change, a good thing. But St. Martin's was saying, we want to get you away from war books so much and, focus on something a little different. So I thought, well, the most different thing I could think of was to find a single historical figure that I could get into his head and explore his world the way he would see it. And that was Teddy Roosevelt.
Right.
So I really worked hard on that book. I wanted to get it right. I was very happy with the way that book turned out. And what I was amazed is how many people love Teddy Roosevelt.
Oh,
I mean,
yeah.
people wrote me and said, "Oh, this is great. No, happy to see a book like this," because there are really no novels from Roosevelt's own point of view. I mean, there's all kinds of history books, there's all kinds of nonfiction, and there's memoirs from Roosevelt's point of view, but nobody had ever really done it as a novel. So that sort of occupied my time for a while. But then when I got finished with all that, I said, I think it's maybe time, especially with what's going on in the news, these
Yes.
days, that maybe it's time to go back and look at the Cuban Missile Crisis. One of the things that drives me is, I mean, yes, I experienced it. I've talked to a lot of people my age and older who went through it, people who were in the military and, they had to gear up and all of that. What I'm much more interested in reaching is younger people who weren't there, who didn't go through it, and who really have no idea
Mhm.
how close we came to, nuclear holocaust. And
Right.
that's not an exaggeration. I mean, we came extremely close. And I just thought it was important because I don't know if that's taught in schools. I mean, I really have no idea.
Yeah.
But it's not, well, here's a lesson because young people need to know just how close we came and just how important these people are that dealt with that situation.
Yes. And that's what I find great about your fiction is that you make history accessible to a broader swath of Americans who, some people might be leery of picking up a history book, but they want to read a novel. And I think your novels kind of really just kind of drive people into it more. And so the fact that we're talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis is important because you're right. As time marches on, people get further and further away, and a younger generation doesn't know what we went through as a country. So
Right.
yeah.
Exactly.
Well, what were the challenges of writing this particular book? Because I remember a few years ago you had posted some updates on your website about, I'm currently looking at writing about the Cuban Missile Crisis, but it's missing that aspect of like, the war, the war action, the battles. We came close to war, so that's kind of a different approach for you for sure.
Well, definitely. I mean, and that's really one of the points, and that's one of the reasons why St. Martin's Press was happy for me to do this, is that it's not a war book. I mean, it's not the basic, combat, both sides shooting at each other, all of that stuff. It came close, and in some ways, it was war. I mean, out in the middle of the Caribbean Sea. I mean, there were some things going on there that could have gotten very dicey very quickly, and that's part of the story here.
Yep.
But yeah, it was suggested to me when I finished the two books set on the war in the Pacific that I should keep going with that I should go after Midway. You've got Guadalcanal and you've got Iwo Jima and Leyte Gulf. And I mean, that's three books right there.
Right.
I just didn't want to do that. I wanted to get away from that for a while. I had done so many books that had sort of the same theme, and it's a risky thing for me to say this, but in the end, most war books are pretty much the same. I mean, the way the action goes, the way one side goes against the other, and particularly if you look at the Marines, the Navy, the Marines in the Pacific, all those islands, almost every one of them, it's the same story. I mean,
Right.
that's not diminishing what the Marines did because it was extraordinary what they accomplished. But whether you're talking Tinian and Saipan and Guam and on and on and on, it's the same story. And for me, having done of that, I just wanted to do something different. And I
Mhm.
thought that this story, we're talking about today, I thought it was different enough that I would get excited about doing it.
Yes. Yeah. So what kind of research kind of went into it? Did you have to go into the Library of Congress or
No, but as in every book that I do, basically, pretty much every one, it's really essential for me to hear the voices, to find the memoirs, the diaries, the collections of letters of the principal characters.
Mhm.
And in this case, you've got Bobby Kennedy, he did write a memoir of this. You've got Jack Kennedy, JFK. It's told more from Bobby's point of view because getting into John F. Kennedy's head was very complicated because there's a lot going on there,
Yeah.
and not all of it's pleasant.
Yeah.
And I wanted to avoid that. So I tell the story from Bobby's point of view. And then you've got all the people around, and this is where a lot of the research came from, people like Robert McNamara and Dean Rusk, who's the Secretary of State, on and on and on around those particular people. Then on the other side, you've got Khrushchev. I have Khrushchev's memoir, which is this enormous, thick thing. It was edited by his son, Sergei, who actually was an American citizen eventually. He's passed away now. But Khrushchev, I mean, Khrushchev doesn't hold any punches. He talks about his own people. And, as bad as Kennedy had to put up with the peace people, the people, peace at any price versus the warriors, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Curtis LeMay, and people like this who wanted to go to war, they wanted to do the first strike. Khrushchev had exactly the same situation. He had people in his presidium who were like, no, we don't want to do this. We know the Americans have us outgunned, and a war it's mutually assured destruction. I love that phrase.
Yes.
MAD, MAD, mutually assured destruction, which means if we start a war, it doesn't really matter who's going to win because we're destroying each other. Khrushchev understood that. He had people in his presidium who understood it. But then he's also got the hawk, the guy who wants to, let's make the first strike. Let's end this now. It's like, whoa, let's think about this first.
Right.
And then from there, you've got Castro, you've got the Russian general in Cuba, the guy who's in charge, Playev is his name. His job is to, build all the missile silos and put all the missiles in place and get all this ready. But he's supposed to keep it from the Cubans. We're going to do all this work in Cuba. We don't want them to know what's going on.
Right.
So build these big wire fences around all the things, and the Cubans are at the fences looking in like this. And it's an impossible job because Castro, as Khrushchev describes Castro, he's a blowhard, and we can't trust him. He shoots his mouth off, and the newspapers in Miami, particularly the Cuban, the Spanish language newspapers in Miami, they're paying attention to what Castro's saying. And Castro's talking about how, we're going to blow the United States off the face of the earth, and all of a sudden, well, wait a minute here. What is he talking about? So all of this adds up to, first of all, part of it's a comedy of errors. Part of it is deadly serious. And then you've got the peripheral characters, people out in the Caribbean, a Russian submarine commander, an American lieutenant on a destroyer who's in charge. They're the first people to intercept a freighter and stop it so they can investigate what's on the freighter. This is all heady stuff, and it's never been done before. So everything that happens is brand new, and nobody's really sure what's going to happen next. And then I talked about me, my family. I mean, those characters. A college professor with his 2 kids in Tallahassee, Florida, and he's a little liberal and he's a pro-Kennedy guy, but his neighbors around Tallahassee, they're not. I mean, they were Nixon people in 1960, and there are people digging fallout shelters and stuff like that, which I remember as a kid. I remember neighbors that had fallout shelters, and there was nothing humorous about it. I mean, these people were deadly serious of what they thought was going to happen and what they were going to do about it. So it's all that whole combination, I think, makes for a story that surprised me and was a lot of fun to write.
Well, in what ways did it surprise you? That was one of my questions I was going to ask. Like during your research, what did surprise you? What was new about it? Was there anything new that you discovered?
Well, of course, JFK or Bobby Kennedy, they're kind of open books. I mean, there's really not a lot of mystery there. I was happy to get the Khrushchev memoir and get that whole perspective because I had no idea what to expect there. But it was the peripheral characters out in the Caribbean. The Russian Commodore who's on board a submarine who has to stop his captain from launching the missiles. I mean, they're ready to go. And that whole scene, that's a chapter in the book. And then again, the American, the young man who's on the destroyer, who one of his jobs, the captain tells him, okay, put your dress whites on, your best uniform, and so there's 6 of you all together, take a launch and go over to this freighter and tell them what you're doing there. And they do it. And of course, they're every minute, every tick of the clock that goes by, the stress of that, because what's going to happen next? And then to make it worse, they find out there's a Russian submarine on its way closer to them. Well, what's that guy going to do? So
Mm-hmm.
there's an awful lot of if and what if. And
Right.
my hope is that people are surprised, that people find this to be tension, to be a mystery in a way, even though we know how it ends. Um,
Right.
that's my job, is to make
Mm-hmm.
it interesting, even though you know what the ending is.
Yes, and I think you did that very well because you kind of well the book starts with the Bay of Pigs, right?
Right.
So it kind of gives everyone the context of why things went the way they did after that. You know, why Castro reached out to Khrushchev, like, they're coming for me. Um, and then Khrushchev, like you said, was kind of he's an interesting guy in this book. He really comes across sympathetic the way you write him. And I'm sure that, comes maybe from his memoir. I think it's
Mhm.
called, is it Khrushchev Remembers or something like that?
Yes.
Yes. Um, but it begins with the Bay of Pigs, and then we kind of move into, well, we're going to send over some missiles, and if they can have them in Turkey, right, pointed at
Mhm.
us, why can't we have something closer to hand? Which, on the face of it, just from a logical standpoint, makes sense, right?
Right.
Um,
It's logical. I mean, Khrushchev is walking on the shore of the Black Sea with his wife or with his good friend, and they're looking out across the water, and it's, right over there, right across this body of water is Turkey. And the Turks have American nuclear missiles aimed at us.
yeah,
What's the deal here? I mean, fair's fair, and we should be able to put our missiles in Cuba and do
yes,
the same thing to them.
yeah,
Well, that sounds logical on the surface, but there's a lot more to it than that. And
sure.
it puts Kennedy in a real bind, because he has to deal with that. And how do we confront it? And in the end, I mean, without giving anything away, I mean, we're all still here. So I will say that nuclear war did not break out.
Right.
If that ruins it for you, I'm sorry. But, Khrushchev blinked. He realized, okay, we don't have to be as hard nosed as this. We don't have to start a war over this problem.
Mhm.
Let's talk about it first, and ultimately that ends up working.
Yes, and to me that it reads, and just from a historical standpoint, it was heroic of him.
Oh yes,
Sometimes you
yeah. I mean,
right?
it was easy, and particularly in those days, it was easy to cast Khrushchev as the bad guy.
Right.
You had the good guy Americans, the bad guy commies, and Khrushchev was the head commie, so he was the worst of all. But at the end of the day, these are, three-dimensional human beings. I mean, Khrushchev's got a wife and a son and a grandchild,
Yes.
and you see all of that. I mean, so he's thinking about that as well as thinking about what's happening in Cuba. He realizes, I would kind of like my grandchild to grow up,
Yes.
and that enters into his consciousness because again, he's not just the bad guy. He's not just a one-dimensional character.
No, not at all. I really had a better appreciation for Khrushchev reading your novel. I've read several books on the Cuban Missile Crisis, just from nonfiction standpoint, but um, I really loved towards the end of the book, there's a conversation that Khrushchev has with his son, Sergei. Is it
Mhm.
Sergei? And I was wondering if this was from his memoir or if you just kind of imagined it, but I loved it. He basically is talking to Sergei and he says, "You do not negotiate the end of the world."
Mhm.
Because the entire run up is these negotiations going back and forth, taking time for the translation uh and the XCOM meetings with JFK, RFK, and the whole lot of them, the Joint Chiefs. It reads like a thriller, but they're trying to negotiate, and then there's the waffling that Khrushchev did, where
Mhm.
he sent a second letter, and then they're like, well, let's just ignore, like, we didn't get that one. A lot of this stuff was like, you couldn't make this up. This actually
But
happened.
imagine from JFK's point of view and Bobby's point of view and the whole XCOM in Washington, they get the first letter, which is very moderate and very reasonable. And then they get the second letter the next day, which is really hardcore and basically telling them to throw the first letter out. Well, the assumption is in Washington is, did Khrushchev write that second letter because somebody's there holding a machine gun on him?
Mm,
Had he been overthrown?
right.
Because there are a lot of hardline. They don't know in Washington how many hardliners there are in Moscow. Just how many in the Kremlin that want war. I mean, you have to err on the side of caution and think maybe most of them do. But yeah, that's a really interesting thing that happens, and it becomes a real puzzle for people in Washington.
It does. And the bad guys that come across to me in the story are the Warhawks on both sides.
Mhm.
Because you had the Kennedy brothers trying to push back against, LeMay and the rest of them that were just like, let's go. This is what we've been we've been working towards since World War II, you know.
Well, that's the point is that, and Kennedy knows this, that, those guys, I mean, who are now, they're now the Joint Chiefs, but, 10 years, 20 years earlier, they were soldiers. I mean, they were, soldiers, airmen, Marines. They were in the trenches. I mean, they were fighting the war. Now they're the head guys. Now the ones with all the stars on their shoulders.
Mhm.
But their whole life, the way they've been trained is take out your enemy before he can take out you.
Right.
And that's the way they're thinking. And of course, over in Moscow, they're doing the same thing. I mean, there are
Mhm.
people who think exactly the same way. These are people who fought the Germans in World War II and, witnessed the worst a war can be. And that's their training. That's what they know how to do.
Right. Yeah. So I just in my mind's eye, I was just like, they really had a lot of people chirping at them. And then when you get towards the end of it, it's like Khrushchev really paid a price. He's like, I've been humiliated. That's how all the country's going to see me now. But to me, it's like they actually the Soviet Union got something out of it, that we averted nuclear war, but those missiles were taken out of Turkey
Eventually. Yeah, it
eventually,
didn't
not
happen
right
right
away.
away. And that was the most important thing for Kennedy is nobody knew that. That was a huge secret that the
Yes.
Russians kept. The Russians, agreed to keep it a secret, even though Kennedy agreed to, get rid of the missiles in Turkey. One of the things also that wasn't really a problem. The missiles were outdated. They were obsolete. Kennedy knew that. And so, I mean, taking the missiles out of Turkey and instead sending some Polaris submarines into the Mediterranean, which
Mhm.
could do the job much more efficiently,
Oh,
fine. That was no problem at all.
okay.
But, at the end of the day, Turkey, Kennedy realized that it's a tit for tat. I mean, you have to give something if you're going to get something.
True.
But what he got was the Russians keeping it a secret. That way, Kennedy got to look like he won.
Right.
The missiles get yanked out of Cuba. The Russians go home with their tail between their legs. All's well. And then later, the missiles come out of Cuba, but people really don't know that was the deal. So it makes
Right.
Kennedy look like an absolute hero.
Hmm.
And unfortunately, it cost Khrushchev ultimately his life, but I mean, it cost him his position.
Hmm.
He's not a product of being elected. Khrushchev comes to power as all Soviet leaders do because he's a strong man. Well, he weakens himself considerably um, by what he does.
He did. But again, to me, that's what a hero does, And so I kind of really just came away with a better appreciation for just swallowing your pride. But then again, what was the alternative? Just
Right, exactly.
the end of the world as
No,
we know it. Um, I have to say, on a personal note, I really love that you included the Nina, uh, Khrushchev's, I guess you'd call it common law wife. I mean, they were never legally
yeah,
married, but
exactly.
she'd been by his side for, since the beginning.
Decades. Hmm.
Yeah, can you speak to what did you learn a lot about her for this, like the research? Because she sounds like just an accomplished woman whose judgment he really, really, counted on. And
Yeah, she was a powerful woman in her own right. I mean, she earned enormous respect by her position. She supported him absolutely. And in a power struggle type society, which that was, having an ally like her was really important. And I mean, and she, she did definitely supported him, and I think she also kept him alive a little past the fact. I mean, it would have been easy. They would have taken him out. Um, the real hawks in the Kremlin, who eventually did prevail, Brezhnev, who became premier of the Soviet Union, his people, his allies. I think she held them at bay for a while, and allowed Khrushchev to sort of go quietly, to
Yes.
kind of settle into a quiet retirement. Even though he had no power, he lost his position, he lost all his respect from the people. They just sort of erased him. Which, considering how powerful he had been, that's sort of amazing that happens.
Yes, absolutely. And, I was going to tease this, but I think you kind of already spoke to it, but your character of Joseph Russo, the the university professor in Tallahassee, and I don't know if you want me to it becomes clear at the end of the book, you know, who he's modeled
I
on.
think actually that's a real good place to stop. It
Okay.
becomes clear at the end of the book. That's all you need to
I'm
say.
gonna say that. I'm not gonna say anything more, but everyone should check this book out because yeah, you're gonna get a nice little treat at the end. Uh in addition. But well, I just loved it. And is there anything else you'd like the reader to know, like going into this book? Anything else you want to add about?
One of the problems I have dealing with this is what to do next, because there is no sequel to this story. I mean, there is
Mhm.
no chapter two. You have the Vietnam War cranking up, and that's basically the next thing that happens.
Yeah.
And of course, Kennedy's assassination in 1963, a year later, after this book takes place,
Yeah.
which changes history. And, so this in some ways preserved history. The Cuban Missile Crisis, the way it ended up, preserved history for us, preserved us. Um, but then everything changes so completely starting the next year. That's what's fascinating about history. Nothing ever stays the same.
Absolutely. It's fluid. Um, well, are you able to talk more about what is next?
I'm actually doing a lot of research. Talk about a change of pace. I'm doing a lot of research now, and if I could move this camera, I could actually show you the stacks of books over here that I've read. I'm working on a novel from Abraham Lincoln's point of view.
Ah,
And it's not really been done this way. Harold Holzer, who is the #1 Lincoln scholar in the world, as far as I'm
right.
concerned,
Mhm.
he's my muse on this. I mean, he's my advisor and consultant on all of this. He's going to make sure I don't, make any dumb mistakes. But I'm working on that right now, and I hope to have him. I mean, I should be writing the manuscript by about the 1st of June, and I hope to have it this fall to be out next year. I'm on uncharted ground for this. I mean, it's not a Civil War book. I've done a lot of those,
Yes, yeah.
although the Civil War certainly is a character.
Yeah.
Um, but the different characters around Lincoln, it's not just Doris Kearns Goodwin's idea, the team of rivals. There's more to it than that. I mean, there are other people involved in the story. So I hope it works, and it's a challenge, and we'll see. It's different. It's a different approach again. So this is 3 different approaches for me in a row, with Teddy Roosevelt, Cuba, and now this.
Mhm. Mhm.
We'll see. We'll see if it works. I hope it does.
Well, I'm on board. I'll be there. And I'll be there to read it and talk about it on this channel because I love it. And I have noticed with the Old Lion and then now the Shadow of War that yeah, you're kind of moving away from those set pieces of combat.
I had to do that. I just
Yeah.
after 17 books of the deal in combat, I said, I just needed, for my own sake, I just needed to get away from that a little bit. And I'm actually having fun because I'm doing different things. And I just hope that the people who have read my stuff in the past will continue to enjoy it and will continue to follow along.
Wow. Well, I'm sure they will. And I was tempted to ask you an unfair question, but I think I might know now what your answer might be. But what is your favorite book that you've written? Would it be these newer ones that are
Probably, there are 2 answers. actually, there's three, but I'll give you, actually, there's 20.
Of
I won't
course,
do that.
they're all
No,
babies.
probably my best book is my book on Korea, the Frozen Hours, about the Chosin Reservoir.
That is my favorite.
That won 3 awards, including one from the Marine Corps, which was really special. And you know, I had a living veteran sitting in my living room, you know, telling me the story. Somebody who was there, you know, gave me an enormous amount of insight into that. So that, I mean, and just the way it came out, I think that's my best book. My World War I book also won a couple of awards. It's a book that deals with the flying aces. So you got, you know, the Lafayette Escadrille and the Red Baron, and then you have Blackjack Pershing and the Marines at the Belleau Wood, the Meuse Argonne Forest. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that you heard the name maybe, but you really don't know the story. And the
Yes.
story of the Red Baron is I mean, it's fabulous. I mean, a tremendous character. That should have been 2 books. My publisher at the time didn't think there was an audience for 2 books on World War One, so they made me combine it.
I
So
see.
it's a big book, but
Yes.
you know,
Last
I
Man
like that
Standing.
story.
That's the
And
name of it.
probably the most fun of any book I've written is my book on the Mexican War,
Ah,
Gone
yes.
for Soldiers.
Yes.
There's a reason for that. I knew nothing about the Mexican War. Most people don't know anything about that.
Hmm.
But I'd done all this research on my first 2 books, Gods and Generals and The Last Full Measure, and I'm researching Longstreet and Grant and Pickett and, you know, on and on and on, you know, all the characters who were, and all the memoirs talk about how they were in Mexico. Like, oh, okay, I didn't know that. So I go back and I start doing serious research, and Winfield Scott, who's a fabulous character, Santa Anna, you know, the
Yep.
character on the other side. And it was so much fun because you know the names, but the setting is completely different. And all those young guys who become generals in the Civil War, they're all on the same side. And you know, Robert E. Lee is a captain of engineers who's never heard a bullet whistle by his head until
Mhm.
he's in Mexico.
Right.
You know, it was fun, and I had a lot of fun, and I love the fact that people are surprised by that story. That makes me feel good.
Yeah. Those are all fantastic answers and fantastic books. Frozen Hours for me. Yeah, that's definitely my favorite. So I can see where, I mean, that was outstanding. So
Thank you.
yes. All right. Well, let's see. Are you going on tour this summer?
You know, they don't do tours the way they used to.
Okay.
It used to be I would do 30 or 35 cities. Now I'll do less than half a dozen.
Okay.
And it's all about budget. It's all about what it costs. It costs a lot of money to send me out there on the road and put me on an airplane every day and all of that. And all publishers have pretty much cut back on that a lot. So I'll be around. I'll be doing a lot of media.
Yeah.
Um, and you know, things just like this. I'll be doing lots of things like this, and then I'll be
Yes.
doing some traveling, but mostly closer to home where I don't actually have to get on an airplane, which is kind of
Yes.
nice.
Yes,
So if,
absolutely.
you know, so if it's Baltimore or Philadelphia, Washington, you know, that's nice, reasonable distance for me from Gettysburg.
No, oh yes, Gettysburg. I'll get out there one day. It's on my bucket list. Well, Jeff, thanks again for joining us here on the History Shelf. The book is The Shadow of War. Comes out May 14th from St. Martin's Press. Again, thank you for all you do just to highlight our history and make it accessible for so many.
Well, thank you.
Yes.